The Painter's Farewell. The lighthouse beam swept across Nora Winter's studio window, marking time like a metronome as she pressed paint to canvas. Outside, Harbor Bay's waters crashed against the cliffs, the same rhythmic pulse that had drawn her to this remote coastal town 5 years ago. Her gallery, Tidewater, occupied the ground floor of a Victorian building that leaned slightly toward the sea, as if yearning to join it. "You're still working?" Julian Hayes appeared in the doorway, his silhouette tall against the dim hallway light. His architect's portfolio was tucked under his arm, a constant companion these days. Nora smiled without turning. "The Andersons want this seascape for their anniversary. I promised it by Friday." She dabbed ultramarine onto the horizon where sea met sky. "How was Portland?" Julian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set his portfolio on the table and stood behind her, his hands hovering near her shoulders without touching them. That hesitation, that sudden airspace between them, told Nora everything before he spoke a word. "Westbrook. Partners offered me the position." His voice held the practice neutrality he used when presenting to clients. "Lead architect for their Pacific Northwest expansion. It's everything I've been working toward." "That's wonderful," Nora replied, her brush still moving across the canvas. "When do they want you to start?" 2 weeks, he cleared his throat. "In Portland," the brush paused mid-stroke. "I see." They had discussed this possibility for months, his career taking off, her reluctance to leave the coastal home she'd built. But discussions were theoretical. This was real. "Nora, you could come with me. Portland has a vibrant art scene." "We both know that's not what this is about," she said softly, finally turning to face him. The lighthouse beam swept across his face, illuminating, then shadowing, then illuminating again. Julian looked away. Vanessa. The name hung between them like sea mist. Vanessa Reeves, the interior designer who had collaborated with Julian on his breakthrough project 6 months ago. Nora had seen the change since then: late nights, weekend consultations, text messages that made him smile in a way her words hadn't for months. "She's connected to every major developer on the coast," Julian continued, words tumbling out faster now. "She understands this world, what it takes to succeed." I know what you've been." Nora set down her brush, wiping paint-stained fingers on her apron. "I've known for weeks." Julian's expression shifted from surprise to guilt. "I didn't want it to happen this way. No one ever does." Nora turned back to her painting, a storm-tossed sea beneath clearing skies. "But the truth is, Julian, you were already gone. Your body just needed to catch up with your heart." "That's not fair," he protested, but the words lacked conviction. Nora dipped her brush in water, watching blue clouds bloom and disperse. "When I came here, I had nothing but faith in my art. Then you appeared, and I began to have faith in us instead. My mistake." "7 years together isn't a mistake," Julian said, his voice cracking. "No," she agreed, "but thinking someone will stay when they are already searching for the exit, that was mine." The lighthouse beam swept through again. In its momentary glow, she saw Julian's face clearly: the ambition, the remorse, the relief. She recognized that last one most of all. Relief that she wasn't fighting, wasn't making this harder. "Someday," she said, applying one final brushstroke to the canvas, "you'll understand what you're walking away from. Not me, but the person you were when you loved something more than success." Julian reached for her, then stopped himself. "I do love you, Nora." "Perhaps," she nodded, "but not enough to stay. And I love myself too much to ask you to." The next morning, Julian's keys sat on the kitchen counter beside a note. "I'll send for the rest later." "I'm sorry." Nora took the keys and walked to the edge of the property where wildflowers met cliff face. The morning tide was coming in, drawing away, then returning stronger. She threw the keys as far as she could, watching them arc against the dawn sky before disappearing into the endless blue below. "Return when you're ready," she whispered, though there was no one there to hear. "Not to me, but to yourself." Then she returned to her gallery, flipped the sign to open, and began to paint the emptiness until it became something beautiful. Tides of Change, 2 years passed like waves reshaping the shoreline, gradually, then suddenly revealing a new landscape. Nora's gallery, Tidewater, had evolved from a quiet exhibition space into the artistic heart of Harbor Bay. She'd added a coffee corner, workshop areas, and a community wall where local artists displayed their work. The building still leaned toward the sea, but now it was filled with voices, laughter, and the creative energy of people who found sanctuary in its walls. On this particular afternoon, rain drummed against the windows as Nora guided a group of children through their first watercolor lesson. "Remember," she said, moving between their tables, "the water does half the work. Let it blend the colors for you." A small girl named Penny frowned at her paper where blues and greens pooled together. "It's all blurry." "That's perfect," Nora assured her, crouching down. "The ocean never has hard edges. Neither does life." The bell above the door chimed, and Nora glanced up to see Theo Bennett shaking rainwater from his coat. The local bookstore owner carried a newspaper tucked under his arm and wore the expression of someone bearing news. "Kids, keep painting while I speak with Mr. Bennett," Nora said, crossing the room to greet him. "Theo, what brings you out in this weather?" He handed her the newspaper without preamble. Page 3. "Thought you should see it." Nora unfolded the Portland Business Journal, her eyes scanning until they caught on the headline, "Hayes Architectural Under Investigation, Prominent Firm Faces Allegations of Fraud." Her stomach tightened as she read further. Julian's firm, built so rapidly over the past 2 years, was implicated in a scandal involving falsified environmental impact statements for several major developments. The article mentioned Vanessa Reeves specifically, citing her connections to city officials and evidence of bribes to bypass regulations. "Julian always cut corners when deadlines loomed," Nora murmured, more to herself than to Theo. "There's more," Theo said quietly. "The real estate forum online says they've lost their biggest clients." "Word is they're finished." Nora folded the paper carefully, her expression neutral. "Thank you for showing me. Are you all right?" Theo asked, his eyes kind beneath bushy eyebrows. Their friendship had deepened over the past year, though he had never pressed for details about her past. "I'm fine," she said, and was surprised to realize it was true. "It's been a long time since Julian's choices affected my life." Later that evening, after the children had gone home with their paintings and Nora had closed the gallery, she sat alone by the large window overlooking the bay. She unfolded the newspaper again, studying Julian's photograph beside the article. He looked older. Success had hardened rather than softened his features. She wondered if Vanessa would stay now that their carefully constructed world was crumbling. Her phone chimed with a text from Theo. "Dinner at Harborside?" Eleanor made too much chowder again. Nora smiled. Theo's sister was forever accidentally cooking for an army, her way of ensuring Theo and his friends were well fed. She texted back, "Be there in 20. As she pulled on her raincoat, Nora paused before a painting hanging near the door, the storm-tossed sea she'd been working on the night Julian left. She'd kept it as a reminder not of him, but of her own resilience. The storm in the painting was clearing, giving way to calmer waters and distant light. "Some storms," she told the empty gallery, "are worth weathering alone." Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle mist. Nora locked the door behind her and walked toward the harbor, where warm light spilled from the windows of the Harborside Cafe and friends waited with bowls of steaming chowder. She didn't look back at the gallery, didn't think about Julian or what his downfall might mean. The tide was changing again. This time she was standing on solid ground. Broken blueprints, Julian Hayes stood at Harbor Bay's bus stop, a single suitcase beside him, watching fog curl around the lighthouse in the distance. Everything he owned now fit into that suitcase: clothes, a few books, his sketchpad. The architectural awards and design magazines that once filled his Portland apartment had been left behind, along with the remnants of his reputation. The investigation had been swift and merciless. Vanessa had disappeared to Europe 3 days after the first subpoena arrived, leaving Julian to face the consequences alone. His partner, Marcus, had turned state's evidence, revealing how Vanessa had orchestrated the bribes while Julian had signed off on the falsified reports. "I didn't know," he'd insisted to the investigators, But even as the words left his mouth, he recognized the lie. He had known, had chosen not to know, because success had felt too good, too important. Now, 8 months later, he was back in Harbor Bay with no firm, no license, and a suspended sentence hanging over him. The only thing he hadn't lost was his parents' cottage on the edge of town, a property he'd nearly forgotten about until it became his only option. Julian picked up his suitcase and began walking. The coastal road was familiar yet strange, like a dream he'd had long ago. Harbor Bay had changed. New shops lined the main street, and the old fisherman's wharf had been renovated into an artisan marketplace. He paused at a community bulletin board plastered with posters, one of which caught his eye. Monthly art exhibition at Tidewater Gallery. Featured artist, Nora Winters. His heart contracted at the sight of her name. The poster showed a painting of the harbor at dawn, rendered in Nora's distinctive style. Light emerging from shadow, hope carved from hardship. She had flourished in his absence. The cottage was exactly as he remembered, small, weathered, smelling faintly of salt and cedar. Julian dropped his suitcase in the entryway and moved through the rooms, opening windows to release the musty air. On the kitchen counter sat a note from the caretaker, along with a loaf of bread and basic provisions. He spent the afternoon cleaning, grateful for the mindless labor that kept thoughts at bay. When evening came, he walked to the small porch overlooking the bay. In the distance, lights from town reflected on the water. Among them would be Tidewater Gallery. Nora would be there, perhaps hosting visitors, explaining her work, living the life she'd built while his had fallen apart. The next morning, Julian woke early and walked into town. He needed supplies, employment, a reason to face each day. The Help Wanted sign in the window of Harborside Cafe seemed as good a place to start as any. Inside, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard was arranging pastries in a display case. He looked up as Julian entered. "We're not open for another hour." "I saw your sign," Julian said. "I'm looking for work." The man straightened, assessing Julian with shrewd eyes. "You're Julian Hayes. It wasn't a question." Julian nodded, bracing himself for recognition, rejection. "Theo Bennett," the man said, wiping his hands on his apron before extending one. "I own this place and the bookstore next door. What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything," Julian answered honestly. "I'm starting over." Something in Theo's expression shifted. Not pity, but understanding. "Starting over's not easy in a small town. People remember." "I know," Theo nodded slowly. "I need someone to help renovate the back room into a reading space. Construction, painting, that sort of thing. Pays fair, but it's temporary. I'll take it." "One condition," Theo said, his voice hardening slightly. "You cross the street to get to work. You don't go near Tidewater unless invited." Julian's face must have registered surprise because Theo continued. "Nora's important to this community. To me, she's built something good here. I won't watch it disturbed." "I understand," Julian said quietly. "I'm not here to disrupt her life." "Then why are you here?" Julian looked out the window toward the bay, considering the question. "Because I lost my way," he finally said. "And this is the last place I remember being someone I didn't hate." Theo studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Back room's through there. Coffee's on the house. Start tomorrow, 7 a.m. That evening, Julian walked to the edge of town where a public path wound along the cliffs. The setting sun turned the water to burnished gold, the same color Nora used to highlight her ocean scenes. In the fading light, he opened his sketchbook, untouched for months, and began to draw. Not buildings or monuments, but the simple curve of the coastline, the silhouette of the lighthouse, the patterns of waves breaking against rock. For the first time in years, he drew without purpose or ambition, only to remember what it felt like to create something honest. Canvas of redemption, summer unfolded in Harbor Bay like a watercolor washing across the landscape, bright colors bleeding into one another beneath a brilliant sky. For Nora, the season brought tourists eager for seaside paintings and locals gathering for her weekend workshops. For Julian, it brought calluses from hammering, splinters from sanding, and the slow rhythm of rebuilding that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with patience. The reading room at Theo's bookstore was taking shape. Bookshelves built into walls, a window seat overlooking the harbor, warm wooden flooring that Julian had salvaged from a decommissioned fishing boat. He worked mostly in the early mornings and evenings, avoiding the busier hours when customers might recognize him. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of Nora crossing the street to Tidewater, her arms full of canvases or coffee cups, but he kept his promise to Theo and maintained his distance. "You're not hiding very effectively," Theo commented one evening as Julian stained the last bookshelf. "Small town? People talk." Julian ran a cloth along the wood grain. "I'm not hiding. I'm respecting boundaries." Theo nodded, shelving a stack of new arrivals. "Nora knows you're here." Julian's hand stilled. "Has she said anything?" "Not directly, but she's been painting the lighthouse more often lately." Theo gave him a significant look. "The one visible from your parents' cottage." Before Julian could respond, the bell above the door chimed. Eleanor, Theo's sister and co-owner of Harborside Cafe, bustled in with a basket. "Dinner," she announced, setting it on the counter. "And don't tell me you've already eaten, Julian Hayes, because I know that's a lie." Over the weeks, Eleanor had appointed herself Julian's unofficial caretaker, regularly appearing with food and town gossip. Unlike some in Harbor Bay who eyed him with suspicion, Eleanor had decided, for reasons known only to herself, that Julian deserved second chances and proper nutrition in equal measure. "The reading room looks wonderful," she declared, inspecting his work. "We should have a proper opening." "Invite the town," Theo shot her a warning look.
What?"
"It's a community space. The community should celebrate it," she turned to Julian. "You've done beautiful work here. People should see that." "I didn't do it for recognition," Julian said. "No," Eleanor agreed, her expression softening. "That's precisely why it matters." The following Saturday, despite Julian's reservations, the bookstore hosted a small reception for the new reading room. Harbor Bay residents filtered in throughout the evening, admiring the craftsmanship, the clever storage solutions, the way the space invited both solitude and connection. Julian stayed in the background, answering questions when asked, but otherwise letting the work speak for itself. Near closing time, when only a few guests remained, the bell above the door chimed once more. Julian was arranging books on a shelf when he felt a shift in the air, a presence that altered the room's chemistry. He turned to find Nora standing in the doorway. 2 years had changed her in subtle ways. Her dark hair was shorter, curling at her jawline. New smile lines framed her eyes. She wore paint-splattered jeans and a blue blouse that matched the color she always used for deep water. She looked directly at him, her expression unreadable. Theo materialized beside her. "Nora, you made it." "Sorry I'm late," she said, her eyes still on Julian. "Workshop ran long." Julian set down the book in his hands, aware that several people were watching this exchange, holding their breath for drama or reconciliation. He offered neither, simply nodding in greeting. "Hello, Nora," Julian. She stepped further into the room, her gaze shifting to take in the space he'd created. "This is lovely work." "Thank you." An awkward silence stretched between them until Eleanor appeared, tactfully drawing the remaining guests toward the refreshment table, giving them privacy within the public space. Nora ran her fingers along the edge of a bookshelf. "Reclaimed wood? From the Marigold. They scrapped her last spring. I remember that boat. You used to sketch it from the pier." She paused, then added quietly, "I saw the articles about Portland." Julian nodded, accepting this without defense. "I made choices I can't undo." "We all do." Nora's expression softened slightly. "But this," she gestured to the room around them, "this is good work, Julian. Honest work." Coming from Nora, these words meant more than any architectural award ever had. Before he could respond, she continued, "The town council is considering proposals for the old cannery building. They want to convert it into a community arts center." "That's a good use for the space," Julian said, uncertain why she was telling him this. "They need someone who understands both construction and design. Someone who can work within a limited budget." She met his eyes directly. "I suggested you." Julian stared at her, stunned. "Why would you do that?" Because you're good at what you do. Because the town needs this project. She hesitated, then added, and because everyone deserves the chance to build something meaningful. With that, she turned and walked toward the refreshment table, leaving Julian to consider the weight of what she'd offered. Not forgiveness exactly, but possibility. A chance to create something that served others rather than his own ambition. Later that night, Julian walked along the shore path, the lighthouse beams sweeping across the water in steady rhythm. He found himself at the spot where the path passed closest to Tidewater Gallery. The lights were still on inside, and through the window he could see Nora working on a large canvas. She painted with the same intensity he remembered, fully present, fully committed to each brushstroke. He didn't approach, didn't knock, or make his presence known. He simply watched for a moment, grateful that some things remained constant even when everything else had changed. Then he continued walking, the lighthouse beam guiding him home. The sea's wisdom. Autumn painted Harbor Bay in amber and rust, the colors Nora mixed most carefully for her seasonal exhibition. The cannery project had been approved, and for the past 2 months, she'd found herself in regular meetings with Julian, community board members, and local artists planning the conversion. Their professional interactions remained exactly that, professional. Julian presented thoughtful designs that maximized natural light and respected the building's history. Nora advocated for spaces that would serve both established and emerging artists. They were cordial, collaborative, occasionally even friendly, but always with the awareness of their history flowing between them like an underwater current, unseen but powerfully present. On this crisp October morning, they stood alone in the cavernous main room of the cannery, Julian explaining his latest revisions while Nora followed along on the blueprints. "If we reconfigure the north wall," he said, pointing to the plans, "we gain enough space for the ceramics studio without compromising the gallery area." Nora studied the drawing, impressed by the elegant solution. "This works perfectly." Julian nodded, rolling up the plans. "Construction starts next week. We should be weather-tight before the winter storms." A companionable silence settled between them as they walked through the empty building, footsteps echoing against concrete floors and high ceilings. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating particles in the air like floating stars. "I never thanked you properly," Julian said suddenly, "for recommending me for this project." Nora paused by a window overlooking the bay. "You didn't need to be thanked. You earned the opportunity." "Still," he insisted quietly, "it means something. Coming from you." She turned to face him fully. "Why did you come back to Harbor Bay, Julian? Truly?" He considered the question, knowing she deserved complete honesty. "At first, because I had nowhere else to go. The cottage was all I had left." He moved to stand beside her at the window. "But now I think I came back because this place remembers who I was before ambition consumed me. Before I became someone I didn't recognize." "And who are you now?" Nora asked. "I'm still figuring that out," he admitted. "But I know I don't want to be who I was in Portland, successful but hollow. I'd rather build one thing that matters than a dozen that don't." Nora nodded, her expression thoughtful. "The night you left, I told you that someday you'd understand what you were walking away from." "I remember," Julian said softly. "You were right. Only partly," she countered. "I was hurt and trying to sound wise. The truth is, I needed you to leave. I needed to remember who I was on my own." Outside, waves crashed against the rocky shore, a sound so constant in Harbor Bay that it became part of the silence. Julian watched a fishing boat making its way toward the horizon, sails full against the blue sky. "Theo cares for you," he observed. "He does," Nora acknowledged with a small smile. "And I for him." Julian nodded, accepting this without visible reaction. "He's a good man." "Yes, he is." Nora's gaze remained steady. "We're not together, if that's what you're asking. But he matters to me, and I won't hurt him." "I wouldn't ask you to." The sunlight shifted, casting new patterns across the floor. Nora checked her watch. "I should get back to the gallery. I have a class at noon." "Of course." They walked toward the exit together, their footsteps falling into synchronized rhythm. "There's an old fisherman's saying," Nora said as they reached the door. "The sea takes what it wants, but sometimes returns it transformed." Julian looked at her, understanding the reference. "And is what returns worth keeping?" "That depends," she replied, "on whether it's returned because it has nowhere else to go or because it's finally found where it belongs." The question hung between them, unanswered but acknowledged. As they stepped outside, the wind carried the scent of salt and coming rain. They parted ways at the street corner, Nora toward Tidewater, Julian toward the worksite where materials for the cannery renovation were being delivered. Later that evening, as the first autumn storm rolled in from the Pacific, Julian worked alone in the cottage, sketching ideas for built-in storage at the Arts Center. The rain drummed against the roof and wind rattled the windows, the familiar symphony of Harbor Bay weather that he'd once taken for granted. A knock at the door startled him from his concentration. When he opened it, Nora stood on the porch, rain-soaked and breathless. "The storm surge is heading for the cannery," she explained without preamble. "The building committee is sandbagging, but we need more hands." Julian grabbed his coat without hesitation. Together they ran through the downpour toward the old building that was slowly becoming something new. Community members had already formed a chain, passing sandbags from trucks to the building's vulnerable seaward side. Julian and Nora joined without question, working alongside people who hours earlier might have regarded Julian with suspicion, but now accepted his help without comment. Near midnight, with the cannery secured and the tide finally receding, the impromptu crew gathered in Harborside Cafe, which Eleanor had opened as a warming station. Soaked and exhausted, they drank hot coffee and recounted near disasters with the peculiar pride of those who have faced nature and held their ground. Theo handed steaming mugs to Nora and Julian. "Good work tonight, both of you." His simple acknowledgement, including Julian in the community's efforts, felt like a significant shift. Around them, other Harbor Bay residents nodded in agreement, offering small smiles, brief thanks, tiny gestures of acceptance. Later, as the group dispersed, Nora and Julian walked back toward the cannery to check the barriers one final time. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, and the wind had died down to occasional gusts. "Look," Nora said, pointing toward the horizon where the clouds were breaking. The lighthouse beam cut through the darkness, steady and sure. "The worst has passed." Julian nodded, understanding she meant more than the storm. "Do you think the Arts Center will make it?" "Yes," she said confidently. "It's built on a stronger foundation than we knew." They stood side by side, watching the lighthouse beam make its circular journey, illuminating, then passing, then returning again. Like time, like chances. Like the tide that takes and sometimes returns. "I can't go back to who I was," Julian said quietly, "when we were together before." "I wouldn't want you to," Nora replied. "Neither of us can be those people again." "But perhaps," he suggested cautiously, "we could discover who we are now, slowly, as friends first." Nora considered this, her expression thoughtful. Then she extended her hand, not in the formal way of their recent professional interactions, but with palm upturned, an invitation rather than a conclusion. "Friends," she agreed as Julian's hand met hers. "With patience and truth this time." The lighthouse beam swept over them once more, illuminating their joined hands for a brief moment before continuing its endless circuit. In that flash of light, they were not their past or future selves, but simply two people standing together in the gentle rain, choosing to begin again. The sea had taken, transformed, and returned. What happened next would be built stroke by stroke, like a painting, or stone by stone, like a structure, with care, intention, and the wisdom that comes only after weathering storms.